Book 1, Chapter 5. The Lord of Gavrillac. For the second time that day, Andre-Louis set out for the chateau, walking briskly, and heeding not at all the curious eyes that followed him through the village, and the whisperings that marked his passage through the people, all agog by now with that day's event in which he had been an actor. He was ushered by Benoit, the elderly body-servant, rather grandiloquently called the seneschal, into the ground-floor room known traditionally as the library. It still contained several shelves of neglected volumes, from which it derived its title, but implements of the chase, fowling pieces, powder horns, hunting bags, sheath knives, obtruded far more prominently than those of study. The furniture was massive, of oak richly carved, and belonging to another age. Great massive oak beams crossed the rather lofty whitewashed ceiling. Here the squat Seigneur de Gavrillac was restlessly pacing when Andre-Louis was introduced. He was already informed, as he announced at once, of what had taken place at the Breton Arm. M. de Chabrillane had just left him, and he confessed himself deeply grieved and deeply perplexed. "The pity of it," he said. "The pity of it." He bowed his enormous head. "So estimable a young man, and so full of promise. Ah, this La Tour d'Azyr is a hard man, and he feels very strongly in these matters. He may be right. I don't know. I have never killed a man for holding different views from mine. In fact, I have never killed a man at all. It isn't in my nature. I shouldn't sleep of nights if I did. But men are differently made." "The question, monsieur my godfather," said Andre-Louis, "is what is to be done." He was quite calm and self-possessed, but very white. M. de Kercadiou stared at him blankly out of his pale eyes. "Why, what the devil is there to do? From what I am told, Vilmorin went so far as to strike Monsieur le Marquis." "Under the grossest provocation." "Which he himself provoked by his revolutionary language. The poor lad's head was full of this encyclopedist trash. It comes of too much reading. I have never set much store by books, Andre. I have never known anything but trouble to come out of learning. It unsettles a man. It complicates his views of life, destroys the simplicity which makes for peace of mind and happiness. Let this miserable affair be a warning to you, Andre. You are yourself too prone to these new-fashioned speculations upon a different constitution of the social order. You see what comes of it. A fine, estimable young man, the only prop of his widowed mother, too, forgets himself, his position, his duty to that mother, everything, and goes and gets himself killed like this. It is infernally sad. On my soul, it is sad." He produced a handkerchief and blew his nose with vehemence. Andre-Louis felt a tightening of his heart, a lessening of the hopes, never too sanguine, which he had founded upon his godfather. "Your criticisms," he said, "are all for the conduct of the dead, and none for that of the murderer. It does not seem possible that you should be in sympathy with such a crime." "Crime?" shrilled M. de Kercadiou. "My God, boy, you are speaking of M. de La Tour d'Azyr." "I am, and of the abominable murder he has committed." "Stop!" M. de Kercadiou was very emphatic. "I cannot permit that you apply such terms to him. I cannot permit it. Monsieur le Marquis is my friend, and is likely very soon to stand in a still closer relationship." "Notwithstanding this?" asked Andre-Louis. M. de Kercadiou was frankly impatient. "Why, What has this to do with it? I may deplore it, but I have no right to condemn it. It is a common way of adjusting differences between gentlemen." "You really believe that?" "What the devil do you imply, Andre? Should I say a thing that I don't believe? You begin to make me angry." "Thou shalt not kill is the king's law as well as God's." "You are determined to quarrel with me, I think. It was a duel." Andre-Louis interrupted him. "It is no more a duel than if it had been fought with pistols of which only Monsieur le Marquis was loaded. He invited Philippe to discuss the matter further with the deliberate intent of forcing a quarrel upon him and killing him. Be patient with me, monsieur, my godfather. I am not telling you of what I imagine, but what Monsieur le Marquis himself admitted to me." Dominated a little by the young man's earnestness, M. de Kercadiou's pale eyes fell away. He turned with a shrug and sauntered over to the window. "It would need a court of honour to decide such an issue, and we have no courts of honour," he said. "But we have courts of justice." With returning testiness, the seigneur swung round to face him again. "And what court of justice, do you think, would listen to such a plea as you appear to have in mind?" "There is the court of the King's Lieutenant at Rennes." "And do you think the King's Lieutenant would listen to you?" "Not to me, perhaps, monsieur. But if you were to bring the plaint..." "I bring the plaint?" M. de Kercadiou's pale eyes were wide with the horror of the suggestion. "The thing happened here on your domain. I bring a plaint against Monsieur de La Tour d'Azyr? You are out of your senses, I think. Oh, you are mad! As mad as that poor friend of yours who has come to this end through meddling in what did not concern him. The language he used here to Monsieur le Marquis on the score of Mabey was of the most offensive. Perhaps you didn't know that. It does not at all surprise me that the Marquis should have desired satisfaction." "I see," said Andre-Louis on a note of hopelessness. "You see? Well, what the devil do you see?" "That I shall have to depend upon myself alone." "And what the devil do you propose to do, if you please?" "I shall go to Rennes and lay the facts before the King's Lieutenant." "He'll be too busy to see you." M. de Kercadiou's mind swung a trifle inconsequently, as weak minds will. "There is trouble enough in Rennes already on the score of these crazy States General, with which the wonderful M. Necker is to repair the finances of the kingdom, as if a peddling Swiss bank clerk, who is also a damned Protestant, could succeed where such men as Calonne and Brienne have failed." "Good afternoon, monsieur, my godfather," said Andre-Louis. "Where are you going?" was the querulous demand. "Home at the present. To Rennes in the morning." "Wait, boy, wait!" The squat little man rolled forward, affectionate concern on his great, ugly face, and he set one of his podgy hands on his godson's shoulder. "Now, listen to me, Andre," he reasoned. "This is sheer knight-errantry, moonshine, lunacy. You'll come to no good by it if you persist. You've read Don Quixote, and what happens to him when he went tilting against windmills? It's what will happen to you, neither more nor less. Leave things as they are, my boy. I wouldn't have a mischief happen to you." Andre-Louis looked at him, smiling wanly. "I swore an oath today, which it would damn my soul to break,"
You mean that you'll go, in spite of anything that I may say?"
Impetuous as he was inconsequent, M. de Kercadiou was bristling again.
"Very well, then. Go! Go to the devil!"
"I will begin with the king's lieutenant."
"And if you get into the trouble you are seeking, don't come whimpering to me for assistance," the seigneur stormed. He was very angry now. "Since you choose to disobey me, you can break your empty head against the windmill, and be damned to you."
Andre-Louis bowed with a touch of irony and reached the door. "If the windmill should prove too formidable," said he, from the threshold, "I may see what can be done with the wind. Good-bye, monsieur my godfather." He was gone, and M. de Kercadiou was alone, purple in the face, puzzling out that last cryptic utterance, and not at all happy in his mind, either on the score of his godson or of M. de la Tour d'Azyr. He was disposed to be angry with them both. He found these headstrong, wilful men who relentlessly followed their own impulses very disturbing and irritating. Himself, he loved his ease, and to be at peace with his neighbours, and that seemed to him so obviously the supreme good of life that he was disposed to brand them as fools who troubled to seek other things. Chapter 6. The Windmill. There was between Nantes and Rennes an established service of 3 stagecoaches weekly in each direction, which, for a sum of 24 livres, roughly the equivalent of an English guinea, would carry you the 70 and odd miles of the journey in some 14 hours. Once a week one of the diligences, going in each direction, would swerve aside from the highroad to call at Gavrillac, to bring and take letters, newspapers, and sometimes passengers. It was usually by this coach that Andre-Louis came and went when the occasion offered. At present, however, he was too much in haste to lose a day awaiting the passing of that diligence. So it was on a horse hired from the Breton Arme that he set out next morning, and an hour's brisk ride under a grey, wintry sky by a half-ruined road through 10 miles of flat, uninteresting country brought him to the city of Rennes. He rode across the main bridge over the Vilaine, and so into the upper and principal part of that important city of some 30,000 souls, most of whom, he opined from the seething, clamant crowds that everywhere blocked his way, must on this day have taken to the streets. Clearly, Philippe had not overstated the excitement prevailing there. He pushed on as best he could, and so came at last to the Place Royale, where he found the crowd to be most dense. From the plinth of the equestrian statue of Louis XV, a white-faced young man was excitedly addressing the multitude. His youth and dress proclaimed the student, and a group of his fellows, acting as a guard of honour to him, kept the immediate precincts of the statue. Over the heads of the crowd, Andre-Louis caught a few of the phrases flung forth by that eager voice. "It was the promise of the king. It is the king's authority they flout. They abrogate to themselves the whole sovereignty in Brittany. The king has dissolved them. These insolent nobles defying their sovereign and the people." Had he not known already, from what Philippe had told him, of the events which had brought the Third Estate to the point of active revolt, those few phrases would fully have informed him. This popular display of temper was most opportune to his need, he thought, and in the hope that it might serve his turn by disposing to reasonableness the mind of the king's lieutenant, he pushed on up the wide and well-paved Rue Royale, where the concourse of people began to diminish. He put up his hired horse at the Combe de Cerf, and set out again on foot to the Palais de Justice. There was a brawling mob by the framework of poles and scaffoldings about the building cathedral, upon which work had been commenced a year ago, but he did not pause to ascertain the particular cause of that gathering. He strode on, and thus came presently to the handsome Italianate palace that was one of the few public edifices that had survived a devastating fire of 60 years ago. He won through with difficulty to the great hall, known as the Salle des Pas Perdus, where he was left to cool his heels for a full half-hour after he had found an usher so condescending as to inform the god who presided over that shrine of justice that a lawyer from Gavrillac humbly begged an audience on an affair of gravity. That the god condescended to see him at all was probably due to the grave complexion of the hour. At long length he was escorted up the broad stone staircase and ushered into a spacious, meagrely furnished anteroom, to make one of a waiting crowd of clients, mostly men. There he spent another half-hour, and employed the time in considering exactly what he would say. This consideration made him realize the weakness of the case he proposed to set before a man whose views of law and morality were colored by his social rank. At last he was ushered through a narrow but very massive and richly decorated door into a fine, well-lighted room, furnished with enough gilt and satin to have supplied the boudoir of a lady of fashion. It was a trivial setting for a king's lieutenant, but about the king's lieutenant there was, at least to ordinary eyes, nothing trivial. At the far end of the chamber, to the right of one of the tall windows that looked out over the inner court, before a goat-legged writing table with Watteau panels, heavily encrusted with ormolu, sat that exalted being. Above a scarlet coat with an order flaming on its breast, and a billow of lace in which diamonds sparkled like drops of water, sprouted the massive powdered head of Monsieur de Lesdiguières. It was thrown back to scowl upon this visitor with an expectant arrogance that made Andre-Louis wonder almost was a genuflection awaited from him. Perceiving a lean, lantern-jawed young man with straight, lank black hair in a caped riding-coat of brown cloth, and yellow buckskin breeches, his knee-boots splashed with mud, the scowl upon that august visage deepened until it brought together the thick, black eyebrows above the great hooked nose. "You announce yourself as a lawyer of Gavrillac, with an important communication," he growled. It was a peremptory command to make this communication without wasting the valuable time of a king's lieutenant, of whose immense importance it conveyed something more than a hint. Monsieur de Lesdiguières accounted himself an imposing personality, and he had every reason to do so, for in his time he had seen many a poor devil scared out of all his senses by the thunder of his voice. He waited now to see the same thing happen to this youthful lawyer from Gavrillac, but he waited in vain. Andre-Louis found him ridiculous. He knew pretentiousness for the mask of worthlessness and weakness, and here he beheld pretentiousness incarnate. It was to be read in that arrogant poise of the head, that scowling brow, that inflection of that reverberating voice. Even more difficult than it is for a man to be a hero to his valet, who has witnessed the dispersal of the parts that make up the imposing whole, is it for a man to be a hero to the student of man, who has witnessed the same in a different sense. Andre-Louis stood forward boldly, impudently, thought Monsieur de Lesdiguières. "You are His Majesty's lieutenant here in Brittany," he said, and it almost seemed to the august lord of life and death that this fellow had the incredible effrontery to address him as one man speaking to another. "You are the dispenser of the king's high justice in this province." Surprise spread on that handsome, sallow face under the heavily powdered wig. "Is your business concerned with this infernal insubordination of the canaille?" he asked. "It is not, monsieur." The black eyebrows rose.
Then what the devil do you mean by intruding upon me at a time when all my attention is being claimed by the obvious urgency of this disgraceful affair?" "The affair that brings me is no less disgraceful and no less urgent." "It will have to wait," thundered the great man in a passion, and tossing back a cloud of lace from his hand, he reached for the little silver bell upon his table. "A moment, monsieur." Andre-Louis' tone was peremptory. Monsieur de Lesdiguières checked in sheer amazement at its impudence. "I can state it very briefly." "Haven't I said already?" "And when you have heard it," Andre-Louis went on relentlessly, interrupting the interruption, "you will agree with me as to its character." Monsieur de Lesdiguières considered him very sternly. "What is your name?" he asked. "Andre-Louis Moreau." "Well, Andre-Louis Moreau, if you can state your plea briefly, I will hear you. But I warn you that I shall be very angry if you fail to justify the impertinence of this insistence at so inopportune a moment." "You shall be the judge of that, monsieur," said Andre-Louis, and he proceeded at once to state his case, beginning with the shooting of Mabey, and passing thence to the killing of M. de Vilmorin. But he withheld until the end the name of the great gentleman against whom he demanded justice, persuaded that, did he introduce it earlier, he would not be allowed to proceed. He had a gift of oratory of whose full powers he was himself hardly conscious yet, though destined very soon to become so. He told his story well, without exaggeration, yet with a force of simple appeal that was irresistible. Gradually the great man's face relaxed from its forbidding severity. Interest, warming almost to sympathy, came to be reflected on it. "And who, sir, is the man you charge with this?" "The Marquis de La Tour d'Azyr." The effect of that formidable name was immediate. Dismayed anger and an arrogance more utter than before took the place of the sympathy he had been betrayed into displaying. "Who?" he shouted, and without waiting for an answer. "Why, here's impudence!" he stormed on. "To come before me with such a charge against a gentleman of M. de La Tour d'Azyr's eminence! How dare you speak of him as a coward?" "I speak of him as a murderer," the young man corrected, "and I demand justice against him." "You demand it, do you? My God, what's next?" "That is for you to say, monsieur." It surprised the great gentleman into a more or less successful effort of self-control. "Let me warn you," said he acidly, "that it is not wise to make wild accusations against a nobleman. That in itself is a punishable offence, as you may learn. Now listen to me. In this matter of Mabey, assuming your statement of it to be exact, the gamekeeper may have exceeded his duty, but by so little that it is hardly worth comment. Consider, however, that in any case it is not a matter for the King's Lieutenant, or for any court but the seigneurial court of M. de La Tour d'Azyr himself. It is before the magistrates of his own appointing that such a matter must be laid, since it is matter strictly concerning his own seigneurial jurisdiction. As a lawyer, you should not need to be told so much." "As a lawyer, I am prepared to argue the point. But as a lawyer, I also realize that if that case were prosecuted, it could only end in the unjust punishment of a wretched gamekeeper, who did no more than carry out his orders, but who none the less would now be made a scapegoat, if scapegoat were necessary. I am not concerned to hang Bennet on the gallows earned by M. de La Tour d'Azyr." M. de Lesdiguières smote the table violently. "My God!" he cried out, to add more quietly on a note of menace. You are singularly insolent, my man." "That is not my intention, sir. I assure you, I am a lawyer, pleading his case, the case of M. de Vilmorin. It is for his assassination that I have come to beg the king's justice." "But you yourself have said that it was a duel," cried the lieutenant, between anger and bewilderment. "I have said that it was made to appear a duel. There is a distinction, as I shall show, if you will condescend to hear me out." "Take your time, sir," said the ironical M. de Lesdiguieres, whose tenure of office had never yet held anything that remotely resembled this experience. Andre-Louis took him literally. "I thank you, sir," he answered solemnly, and submitted his argument. "It can be shown that M. de Vilmorin never practised fencing in all his life, and it is notorious that M. de La Tour d'Azyr is an exceptional swordsman. Is it a duel, monsieur, where one of the combatants alone is armed? For it amounts to that on a comparison of their measures of respective skill." "There has scarcely been a duel fought on which the same trumpery argument might not be advanced." "But not always with equal justice. And in one case at least it was advanced successfully." "Successfully? When was that?"
10 years ago in Dauphiny. I refer to the case of M. de Gesvres, a gentleman of that province, who forced a duel upon M. de la Roche Jeannin, and killed him. M. de Jeannin was a member of a powerful family which exerted itself to obtain justice. It put forward just such arguments as now obtain against M. de La Tour d'Azyr. As you will remember, the judges held that the provocation had proceeded on intent from M. de Gesvres. They found him guilty of premeditated murder, and he was hanged. M. de Lesdiguieres exploded yet again.
"Death of my life!" he cried. "Have you the effrontery to suggest that M. de La Tour d'Azyr should be hanged? Have you?"
"But why not, monsieur, if it is the law, and there is precedent for it, as I have shown you, and if it can be established that what I state is the truth, as established it can be without difficulty."
"Do you ask me why not? Have you temerity to ask me that?"
"I have, monsieur. Can you answer me? If you cannot, monsieur, I shall understand that whilst it is possible for a powerful family like that of La Roche-Jeannin to set the law in motion, the law must remain inert for the obscure and uninfluential, however brutally wronged by a great nobleman." M. de Lesdiguieres perceived that in argument he would accomplish nothing against this impassive, resolute young man. The menace of him grew more fierce.
"I should advise you to take yourself off at once, and to be thankful for the opportunity to depart unscathed."
"I am then to understand, monsieur, that there will be no inquiry into this case? That nothing that I can say will move you?"
"You are to understand that if you are still there in 2 minutes, it will be very much the worse for you."
And M. de Lesdiguieres tinkled the silver handbell upon his table. "I have informed you, monsieur, that a duel, so-called, has been fought and a man killed. It seems that I must remind you, the administrator of the king's justice, that duels are against the law, and that it is your duty to hold an inquiry. I come as the legal representative of the bereaved mother of M. de Vilmorin to demand of you the inquiry that is due." The door behind Andre-Louis opened softly. M. de Lesdiguieres, pale with anger, contained himself with difficulty.
"You seek to compel us, do you? You impudent rascal!" he growled. You think that the king's justice is to be driven headlong by the voice of any impudent roturier? I marvel at my own patience with you. But I give you a last warning, master lawyer. Keep a closer guard over that insolent tongue of yours, or you will have cause very bitterly to regret its glibness." He waved a jewelled, contemptuous hand, and spoke to the usher standing behind Andre. "To the door," he said shortly. Andre-Louis hesitated a second. Then with a shrug he turned. This was the windmill, indeed, and he, a poor knight of rueful countenance, to attack it at close quarters would mean being dashed to pieces. Yet on the threshold he turned again. "Monsieur de Lesdiguières," said he, "may I recite to you an interesting fact in natural history? The tiger is a great lord in the jungle, and was for centuries the terror of lesser beasts, including the wolf. The wolf, himself a hunter, wearied of being hunted. He took to associating with other wolves, and then the wolves, driven to form packs for self-protection, discovered the prowler of the pack, and took to hunting the tiger, with disastrous results to him. You should study Buffon, Monsieur de Lesdiguières." "I have studied a buffoon this morning, I think," was the punning sneer with which Monsieur de Lesdiguières replied. But that he conceived himself witty, it is probable he would not have condescended to reply at all. "I don't understand you," he added. "But you will, Monsieur de Lesdiguières. You will," said Andre-Louis, and so departed. Chapter 7. The Wind. He had broken his futile lance with the windmill. The image suggested by M. de Kercadiou persisted in his mind. And it was, he perceived, by sheer good fortune that he had escaped without hurt. There remained the wind itself, the whirlwind, and the events in Rennes, reflex of the graver events in Nantes, had set that wind blowing in his favour. He set out briskly to retrace his steps toward the Place Royale, where the gathering of the populace was greatest, where, as he judged, lay the heart and brain of this commotion that was exciting the city. But the commotion that he had left there was as nothing to the commotion which he found on his return. Then there had been a comparative hush to listen to the voice of a speaker who denounced the First and Second Estates from the pedestal of the statue of Louis XV. Now the air was vibrant, with the voice of the multitude itself raised in anger. Here and there men were fighting with canes and fists. Everywhere a fierce excitement raged, and the gendarmes sent thither by the king's lieutenant to restore and maintain order were so much helpless flotsam in that tempestuous human ocean. There were cries of, "To the Palais! To the Palais! Down with the assassins! Down with the nobles! To the Palais!" An artisan who stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the press enlightened Andre-Louis on the score of the increased excitement. "They've shot him dead. His body is lying there where it fell at the foot of the statue. And there was another student killed not an hour ago over there by the cathedral works. Pardy! If they can't prevail in one way, they'll prevail in another." The man was fiercely emphatic. "They'll stop at nothing. If they can't overawe us, by God, they'll assassinate us. They are determined to conduct these states of Brittany in their own way. No interests but their own shall be considered." Andre-Louis left him still talking, and clove himself a way through that human press. At the statue's base he came upon a little cluster of students about the body of the murdered lad, all stricken with fear and helplessness. "You here, Moreau?" said a voice. he looked round to find himself confronted by a slight, swarthy man of little more than 30, firm of mouth and impertinent of nose, who considered him with disapproval. It was Le Chapelier, a lawyer of Rennes, a prominent member of the literary chamber of that city, a forceful man, fertile in revolutionary ideas, and of an exceptional gift of eloquence. "Ah, it's you, Chapelier. Why don't you speak to them? Why don't you tell them what to do? Up with you, man!" And he pointed to the plinth. Le Chapelier's dark, restless eyes searched the other's impassive face for some trace of the irony he suspected. They were as wide asunder as the poles, these two, in their political views. And mistrusted as Andre-Louis was by all his colleagues of the literary chamber of Rennes, he was by none mistrusted so thoroughly as by this vigorous republican. Indeed, had Le Chapelier been able to prevail against the influence of the seminarist Vilmorin, Andre-Louis would long since have found himself excluded from that assembly of the intellectual youth of Rennes, which he exasperated by his eternal mockery of their ideals. So now Le Chapelier suspected mockery in that invitation, suspected it even when he failed to find traces of it on Andre-Louis's face. For he had learnt by experience that it was a face not often to be trusted for any indication of the real thoughts that moved behind it. "Your notions and mine on that score can hardly coincide," said he. "Can there be two opinions?" quoth Andre-Louis. "There are usually two opinions whenever you and I are together, Moreau. More than ever now that you are the appointed delegate of a nobleman. You see what your friends have done. No doubt you approve their methods." He was coldly hostile. Andre-Louis looked at him without surprise. So invariably opposed to each other in academic debates, how should Le Chapelier suspect his present intentions? "If you won't tell them what is to be done, I will," said he. "Nom de Dieu! If you want to invite a bullet from the other side, I shall not hinder you. It may help to square the account." Scarcely were the words out than he repented them, for as if in answer to that challenge, Andre-Louis sprang up onto the plinth. Alarmed now, for he could only suppose it to be Andre-Louis's intention to speak on behalf of privilege, of which he was a publicly appointed representative. Le Chapelier clutched him by the leg to pull him down again. "Ah, that, no!" he was shouting. "Come down, you fool! Do you think we will let you ruin everything by your clowning? Come down!" Andre-Louis, maintaining his position by clutching one of the legs of the bronze horse, flung his voice like a bugle note over the heads of the seething mob. "Citizens of Rennes, the motherland is in danger." The effect was electric. A stir ran like a ripple over water across that froth of upturned human faces, and completest silence followed. In that great silence they looked at this slim young man, hatless, long wisps of his black hair fluttering in the breeze, his neckcloth in disorder, his face white, his eyes on fire. Andre-Louis felt a sudden surge of exultation as he realized by instinct that at one grip he had seized that crowd, and that he held it fast in the spell of his cry and his audacity. Even Le Chapelier, though still clinging to his ankle, had ceased to tug. The reformer, though unshaken in his assumption of Andre-Louis's intentions, was for a moment bewildered by the first note of his appeal. And then, slowly, impressively, in a voice that travelled clear to the ends of the square, the young lawyer of Gavrillac began to speak. Shuddering in horror, of the vile deed here perpetrated. My voice demands to be heard by you. You have seen murder done under your eyes. The murder of one who nobly, without any thought of self, gave voice to the wrongs by which we are all oppressed. Fearing that voice, shunning the truth as foul things shun the light, our oppressors sent their agents to silence him in death. Le Chapelier released at last his hold of Andre-Louis' ankle, staring up at him the while in sheer amazement. It seemed that the fellow was in earnest, serious for once, and for once on the right side. What had come to him? Of assassins, what shall you look for but assassination? I have a tale to tell which will show that this is no new thing that you have witnessed here today. It will reveal to you the forces with which you have to deal. Yesterday... There was an interruption. A voice in the crowd, some 20 paces perhaps, was raised to shout, "Yet another of them!" Immediately after the voice came a pistol shot, and a bullet flattened itself against the bronze figure just behind Andre-Louis. Instantly there was turmoil in the crowd, most intense about the spot whence the shot had been fired. The assailant was one of a considerable group of the opposition, a group that found itself at once beset on every side and hard put to it to defend him. From the foot of the plinth rang the voice of the students making chorus to Le Chapelier, who was bidding Andre-Louis to seek shelter. "Come down! Come down at once! They'll murder you as they murdered La Riviere!" "Let them!" He flung wide his arms in a gesture supremely theatrical, and he laughed. "I stand here at their mercy. Let them, if they will, add mine to the blood that will presently rise up to choke them. Let them assassinate me. It is a trade they understand. But until they do so, they shall not prevent me from speaking to you, from telling you what is to be looked for in them." And again he laughed, not merely in exultation as they supposed who watched him from below, but also in amusement. And his amusement had two sources. One was to discover how glibly he uttered the phrases proper to whip up the emotions of a crowd. The other was in the remembrance of how the crafty Cardinal de Retz, for the purpose of inflaming popular sympathy on his behalf, had been in the habit of hiring fellows to fire upon his carriage. He was in just such a case as that arch-politician. True, he had not hired the fellow to fire that pistol shot, but he was none the less obliged to him, and ready to derive the fullest advantage from the act. The group that sought to protect that man was battling on, seeking to hew a way out of that angry, heaving press. "Let them go," Andre called down. "What matters one assassin more or less? Let them go, and listen to me, my countrymen." And presently, when some measure of order was restored, he began his tale. In simple language now, yet with a vehemence and directness that drove home every point. He tore their hearts with the story of yesterday's happenings at Gavrillac. He drew tears from them with the pathos of his picture of the bereaved widow Mabie and her 3 starving, destitute children, orphaned to avenge the death of a pheasant, and the bereaved mother of that Monsieur de Vilmorin, a student of Rennes, known here to many of them, who had met his death in a noble endeavour to champion the cause of an esurient member of their afflicted order. The Marquis de la Tour d'Azyr said of him that he had too dangerous a gift of eloquence. It was to silence his brave voice that he killed him. But he has failed of his object, for I, poor Philippe de Vilmorin's friend, have assumed the mantle of his apostleship, and I speak to you with his voice today." It was a statement that helped Le Chapelier at last to understand, at least in part, this bewildering change in Andre-Louis, which rendered him faithless to the side that employed him. "I am not here," continued Andre-Louis, "merely to demand at your hands vengeance upon Philippe de Vilmorin's murderers. I am here to tell you the things he would today have told you had he lived." So far, at least, he was frank. But he did not add that they were things he did not himself believe, things that he accounted the cant by which an ambitious bourgeoisie, speaking through the mouths of the lawyers who were its articulate part, sought to overthrow to its own advantage the present state of things. He left his audience in the natural belief that the views he expressed were the views he held. And now, in a terrible voice, with an eloquence that amazed himself, he denounced the inertia of the royal justice, where the great are the offenders. It was with bitter sarcasm that he spoke of their king's lieutenant, Monsieur de Lesdiguieres. "Do you wonder," he asked them, "that Monsieur de Lesdiguieres should administer the law so that it shall ever be favourable to our great nobles? Would it be just, would it be reasonable that he should otherwise administer it?" He paused dramatically to let his sarcasm sink in. It had the effect of reawakening Le Chapelier's doubts, and checking his dawning conviction of Andre-Louis' sincerity. Whither was he going now? He was not left long in doubt. Proceeding, Andre-Louis spoke as he conceived that Philippe de Vilmorin would have spoken. He had so often argued with him, so often attended the discussions of the literary chamber, that he had all the rant of the reformers. That was yet true in substance, at his fingers' ends. "Consider, after all, the composition of this France of ours. 1,000,000 of its inhabitants are members of the privileged classes. They compose France. They are France. For surely you cannot suppose the remainder to be anything that matters. It cannot be pretended that 24 million souls are of any account, that they can be representative of this great nation, or that they can exist for any purpose but that of servitude to the million elect." Bitter laughter shook them now, as he desired it should. Seeing their privileges in danger of invasion by these 24 millions, mostly canaille, possibly created by God, it is true, but clearly so created to be the slaves of privilege. Does it surprise you that the dispensing of royal justice should be placed in the stout hands of these Lesdiguieres, men without brains to think or hearts to be touched? Consider what it is that must be defended against the assault of us others, canaille. Consider a few of these feudal rights that are in danger of being swept away should the privileged yield even to the commands of their sovereign, and admit the third estate to an equal vote with themselves. What would become of the right of terrage on the land, of parciere on the fruit trees, of carpeaux on the vines? What of the corvies by which they command forced labour, of the ban de vendage, which gives them the first vintage, the bain vin, which enables them to control to their own advantage the sale of wine. What of their right of grinding the last liard of taxation out of the people to maintain their own opulent estate? The Seine, the Laude et Vin, which absorb a fifth of the value of the land, the Blairies, which must be paid before herds can feed on communal lands, the pulverage to indemnify them for the dust raised on their roads by the herds that go to market, the sextillage on everything offered for sale in the public markets, the étalonnage, and all the rest. What of their rights over men and animals, for field labour, of ferries over rivers, and of bridges over streams, of sinking wells, of warren, of dovecot, and of fire, which last yields them a tax on every peasant hearth? What of their exclusive rights of fishing and of hunting, the violation of which is ranked as almost a capital offence? And what of other rights, unspeakable, abominable, over the lives and bodies of their people, rights which, if rarely exercised, have never been rescinded? To this day, if a noble returning from the hunt were to slay 2 of his serfs to bathe and refresh his feet in their blood, he could still claim in his sufficient defense that it was his absolute feudal right to do so. Roughshod, these million-privileged ride over the souls and bodies of 24 million contemptible canaille, existing but for their own pleasure. Woe betide him who so much as raises his voice in protest in the name of humanity against an excess of these already excessive abuses. I have told you of one remorselessly slain in cold blood for doing no more than that. Your own eyes have witnessed the assassination of another, here, upon this plinth, of yet another over there, by the cathedral works, and the attempt upon my own life. Between them and the justice due to them in such cases stand these Lesdiguières, these king's lieutenants, not instruments of justice, but walls erected for the shelter of privilege and abuse whenever it exceeds its grotesquely excessive rights. Do you wonder that they will not yield an inch, that they will resist the election of a third estate with the voting power to sweep all these privileges away, to compel the privileged to submit themselves to a just equality in the eyes of the law with the meanest of the canaille they trample underfoot, to provide that the moneys necessary to save this state from bankruptcy, into which they have all but plunged it, shall be raised by taxation, to be borne by themselves in the same proportion as by others? Sooner than yield to so much, they prefer to resist even the royal command. A phrase occurred to him used yesterday by Vilmorin, a phrase to which he had refused to attach importance when uttered then. He used it now. In doing this, they are striking at the very foundations of the throne. These fools do not perceive that if that throne falls over, it is they who stand nearest to it who will be crushed!" A terrific roar acclaimed that statement. Tense and quivering with the excitement that was flowing through him, and from him out into that great audience, he stood a moment, smiling ironically. Then he waved them into silence, and he saw by their ready obedience how completely he possessed them. For in the voice with which he spoke, each now recognized the voice of himself, giving at last expression to the thoughts that for months and years had been inarticulately stirring in each simple mind. Presently he resumed, speaking more quietly, that ironic smile about the corner of his mouth growing more marked. "In taking my leave of Monsieur de Lesdiguieres, I gave him warning out of a page of natural history. I told him that when the wolves, roaming singly through the jungle, were weary of being hunted by the tiger, they banded themselves into packs and went a-hunting the tiger in their turn. Monsieur de Lesdiguieres contemptuously answered that he did not understand me, but your wits are better than his. You understand me, I think, don't you?" Again, a great roar, mingled now with some approving laughter, was his answer. He had wrought them up to a pitch of dangerous passion, and they were ripe for any violence to which he urged them. If he had failed with the windmill, at least he was now master of the wind. "To the Palais!" they shouted, waving their hands, brandishing canes, and here and there even a sword. "To the Palais! Down with Monsieur de Lesdiguieres! Death to the King's lieutenant!" He was master of the wind indeed. His dangerous gift of oratory, a gift nowhere more powerful than in France, since nowhere else are men's emotions so quick to respond to the appeal of eloquence, had given him this mastery. At his bidding now, the gale would sweep away the windmill against which he had flung himself in vain. But that, as he straightforwardly revealed it, was no part of his intent. "Ah, wait," he bade them. "Is this miserable instrument of a corrupt system worth the attention of your noble indignation?" He hoped his words would be reported to Monsieur de Lesdiguieres. He thought it would be good for the soul of Monsieur de Lesdiguieres to hear the undiluted truth about himself for once. "It is the system itself you must attack and overthrow, not a mere instrument, a miserable painted lath such as this. And precipitancy will spoil everything. Above all, my children, no violence." My children, could his godfather have heard him? "You have seen often already the result of premature violence elsewhere in Brittany, and you have heard of it elsewhere in France. Violence on your part will call for violence on theirs. They welcome the chance to assert their mastery by a firmer grip than heretofore. The military will be sent for. You will be faced by the bayonets of mercenaries. Do not provoke that. I implore you. Do not put it into their power. Do not afford them the pretext they would welcome to crush you down into the mud of your own blood." Out of the silence into which they had fallen anew broke now the cry of, "What else, then? What else?" "I will tell you," he answered them. "The wealth and strength of Brittany lies in Nantes, a bourgeois city, one of the most prosperous in this realm. rendered so by the energy of the bourgeoisie and the toil of the people. It was in Nantes that this movement had its beginning, and as a result of it, the king issued his order dissolving the states as now constituted, an order which those who base their power on privilege and abuse do not hesitate to thwart. Let Nantes be informed of the precise situation, and let nothing be done here until Nantes shall have given us the lead. She has the power, which we in Rennes have not, to make her will prevail, as we have seen already. Let her exert that power once more, and until she does so, do you keep the peace in Rennes. Thus shall you triumph. Thus shall the outrages that are being perpetrated under your eyes be fully and finally avenged." As abruptly as he had leapt upon the plinth did he now leap down from it. He had finished. He had said all, perhaps more than all, that could have been said by the dead friend with whose voice he spoke. But it was not their will that he should thus extinguish himself. The thunder of their acclamations rose deafeningly upon the air. He had played upon their emotions, each in turn, as a skilful harpist plays upon the strings of his instrument, and they were vibrant with the passions he had aroused, and the high note of hope on which he had brought his symphony to a close. A dozen students caught him as he leapt down, and swung him to their shoulders, where again he came within view of all the acclaiming crowd. The delicate La Chapelier pressed alongside of him with flushed face and shining eyes. "My lad," he said to him, "you have kindled a fire today that will sweep the face of France in a blaze of liberty." And then to the students he issued a sharp command. "To the literary chamber, at once! We must concert measures upon the instant. A delegate must be dispatched to Nantes forthwith, to convey to our friends there the message of the people of Rennes." The crowd fell back, opening a lane through which the students bore the hero of the hour. Waving his hands to them, he called upon them to disperse to their homes, and await there in patience what must follow very soon. "You have endured for centuries, with a fortitude that is a pattern to the world," he flattered them. "Endure a little longer yet. The end, my friends, is well in sight at last." They carried him out of the square and up the Rue Royale to an old house, one of the few old houses surviving in that city that had risen from its ashes, where in an upper chamber, lighted by diamond-shaped panes of yellow glass, the literary chamber usually held its meetings. Thither in his wake the members of that chamber came hurrying, summoned by the messages that Le Chapelier had issued during their progress. Behind closed doors, a flushed and excited group of some 50 men, the majority of whom were young, ardent, and afire with the illusion of liberty, hailed Andre-Louis as the strayed sheep who had returned to the fold, and smothered him in congratulations and thanks. Then they settled down to deliberate upon immediate measures, whilst the doors below were kept by a guard of honor that had improvised itself from the masses. And very necessary was this, for no sooner had the chamber assembled than the house was assailed by the gendarmerie of M. de Lesdiguières, dispatched in haste to arrest the firebrand who was inciting the people of Rennes to sedition. The force consisted of 50 men. 500 would have been too few. The mob broke their carbines, broke some of their heads, and would indeed have torn them into pieces had they not beaten a timely and well-advised retreat before a form of horseplay to which they were not at all accustomed. And whilst that was taking place in the street below, In the room above stairs, the eloquent Le Chapelier was addressing his colleagues of the literary chamber. Here, with no bullets to fear, and no one to report his words to the authorities, Le Chapelier could permit his oratory a full, unintimidated flow, and that considerable oratory was as direct and brutal as the man himself was delicate and elegant. He praised the vigor and the greatness of the speech they had heard from their colleague Moreau. Above all, he praised its wisdom. Moreau's words had come as a surprise to them. Hitherto they had never known him as other than a bitter critic of their projects of reform and regeneration. And quite lately they had heard, not without misgivings, of his appointment as delegate for a nobleman in the States of Brittany. But they held the explanation of his conversion. The murder of their dear colleague Vilmorin had produced this change. In that brutal deed, Moreau had beheld at last, in true proportions, the workings of that evil spirit which they were vowed to exorcise from France. And today he had proven himself the stoutest apostle among them of the new faith. He had pointed out to them the only sane and useful course. The illustration he had borrowed from natural history was most apt. Above all, let them pack like wolves, and to ensure this uniformity of action in the people of all Brittany, let a delegate at once be sent to Nantes, which had already proved itself the real seat of Brittany's power. It but remained to appoint that delegate, and Le Chapelier invited them to elect him. Andre-Louis, on a bench near the window, a prey now to some measure of reaction, listened in bewilderment to that flood of eloquence. As the applause died down, he heard a voice exclaiming, "I propose to you that we appoint our leader here, Le Chapelier, to be that delegate." Le Chapelier reared his elegantly dressed head, which had been bowed in thought, and it was seen that his countenance was pale. Nervously he fingered a gold spyglass. "My friends," he said slowly, "I am deeply sensible of the honor that you do me, but in accepting it I should be usurping an honor that rightly belongs elsewhere. Who could represent us better? Who more deserving to be our representative, to speak to our friends of Nantes with the voice of Rennes than the champion who once already today has so incomparably given utterance to the voice of this great city? Confer this honor of being your spokesman where it belongs, upon Andre-Louis Moreau." Rising in response to the storm of applause that greeted the proposal, Andre-Louis bowed and forthwith yielded. "Be it so," he said simply. "It is perhaps fitting that I should carry out what I have begun, though I too am of the opinion that Le Chapelier would have been a worthier representative. I will set out tonight." "You will set out at once, my lad," Le Chapelier informed him, and now revealed what an uncharitable mind might account the true source of his generosity. "It is not safe after what has happened for you to linger an hour in Rennes, and you must go secretly. Let none of you allow it to be known that he has gone. I would not have you come to harm over this, Andre-Louis, but you must see the risks you run, and if you are to be spared, to help in this work of salvation of our afflicted motherland, you must use caution, move secretly, veil your identity even, or else Monsieur de Lesdiguières will have you laid by the heels, and it will be good night for you." Chapter 8. Omnes Omnibus. Andre-Louis rode forth from Rennes, committed to a deeper adventure than he had dreamed when he left the sleepy village of Gavrillac. Lying the night at a roadside inn, and setting out again early in the morning, he reached Nantes soon after noon of the following day. Through that long and lonely ride, through the dull plains of Brittany, now at their dreariest in their winter garb, he had ample leisure in which to review his actions and his position. From one who had taken hitherto a purely academic and by no means friendly interest in the new philosophies of social life, exercising his wits upon these new ideas merely as a fencer exercises his eye and wrist with the foils, without ever suffering himself to be deluded into supposing the issue a real one, he found himself suddenly converted into a revolutionary firebrand, committed to revolutionary action of the most desperate kind. The representative and delegate of a nobleman in the States of Brittany, he found himself simultaneously and incongruously the representative and delegate of the whole Third Estate of Rennes. It is difficult to determine to what extent, in the heat of passion, and swept along by the torrent of his own oratory, he might yesterday have succeeded in deceiving himself. But it is at least certain that, looking back in cold blood now, he had no single delusion on the score of what he had done. Cynically he had presented to his audience one side only of the great question that he propounded. But since the established order of things in France was such as to make a rampart for M. de la Tour d'Azyr, affording him complete immunity for this and any other crimes that it pleased him to commit, why, then the established order must take the consequences of its wrong-doing. Therein he perceived his clear justification. And so it was, without misgivings, that he came on his errand of sedition into that beautiful city of Nantes, rendered its spacious streets and splendid port the rival in prosperity of Bordeaux and Marseille. He found an inn on the Quai La Fosse, where he put up his horse, and where he dined in the embrasure of a window that looked out over the tree-bordered quay and the broad bosom of the Loire, on which argosies of all nations rode at anchor. The sun had again broken through the clouds and shed its pale wintry light over the yellow waters and the tall-masted shipping. Along the quays there was a stir of life as great as that to be seen on the quays of Paris. Foreign sailors in outlandish garments and of harsh-sounding outlandish speech, stalwart fishwives with baskets of herrings on their heads, voluminous of petticoat above bare legs and bare feet, calling their wares shrilly and almost inarticulately. Watermen in woolen caps and loose trousers rolled to the knees, peasants in goatskin coats, their wooden shoes clattering on the round kidney stones, shipwrights and labourers from the dockyards, bellows menders, rat catchers, water carriers, ink sellers, and other itinerant peddlers. And sprinkled through this proletariat mass that came and went in constant movement, Andre-Louis beheld tradesmen in sober garments, merchants in long fur-lined coats, occasionally a merchant prince rolling along in his two-horse cabriolet to the whip-crackings and shouts of "Gare!" from his coachman. Occasionally a dainty lady carried past in her sedan chair, with perhaps a mincing abbé from the episcopal court tripping along in attendance. Occasionally an officer in scarlet riding disdainfully, and once the great carriage of a nobleman, with escutcheoned panels and a pair of white-stockinged powdered footmen in gorgeous liveries hanging on behind. And there were Capuchins in brown and Benedictines in black, and secular priests in plenty, for God was well served in the 16 parishes of Nantes. And by way of contrast, there were lean-jawed, out-at-elbow adventurers, and gendarmes in blue coats and gaitered legs, sauntering guardians of the peace. Representatives of every class that went to make up the 70,000 inhabitants of that wealthy, industrious city
were to be seen in the human stream that ebbed and flowed beneath the window from which Andre-Louis observed it. Of the waiter who ministered to his humble wants with soup and bouilli and a measure of vin gris, Andre-Louis inquired into the state of public feeling in the city. The waiter, a staunch supporter of the privileged orders, admitted regretfully that an uneasiness prevailed. Much would depend upon what happened at Rennes. If it was true that the king had dissolved the states of Brittany, then all should be well, and the malcontents would have no pretext for further disturbances. There had been trouble and to spare in Nantes already. They wanted no repetition of it. All manner of rumors were abroad, and since early morning there had been crowds besieging the portals of the Chamber of Commerce for definite news. But definite news was yet to come. It was not even known for a fact that His Majesty actually had dissolved the states. It was striking 2, the busiest hour of the day upon the Bourse, when Andre-Louis reached the Place du Commerce. The square, dominated by the imposing classical building of the Exchange, was so crowded that he was compelled almost to fight his way through to the steps of the magnificent Ionic porch. A word would have sufficed to have opened a way for him at once, but guile moved him to keep silent. He would come upon that waiting multitude as a thunderclap, precisely as yesterday he had come upon the mob at Rennes. He would lose nothing of the surprise effect of his entrance. The precincts of that house of commerce were jealously kept by a line of ushers armed with staves, a guard as hurriedly assembled by the merchants as it was evidently necessary. One of these now effectively barred the young lawyer's passage as he attempted to mount the steps. Andre-Louis announced himself in a whisper. The stave was instantly raised from the horizontal, and he passed and went up the steps in the wake of the usher. At the top, on the threshold of the chamber, he paused and stayed his guide. "I will wait here," he announced. "Bring the president to me." "Your name, monsieur?" Almost had Andre-Louis answered him when he remembered Le Chapelier's warning of the danger with which his mission was fraught, and Le Chapelier's parting admonition to conceal his identity. "My name is unknown to him. It matters nothing. I am the mouthpiece of a people, no more. Go." The usher went, and in the shadow of that lofty pillared portico Andre-Louis waited, his eyes straying out ever and anon to survey that spread of upturned faces immediately below him. Soon the president came, others following, crowding out into the portico, jostling one another in their eagerness to hear the news. "You are a messenger from Rennes?" "I am the delegate sent by the literary chamber of that city to inform you here in Nantes of what is taking place." "Your name?" Andre-Louis paused. "The less we mention names, perhaps the better." The president's eyes grew big with gravity. He was a corpulent, florid man, purse-proud and self-sufficient. He hesitated a moment. Then, "Come into the chamber," said he. "By your leave, monsieur, I will deliver my message from here, from these steps." "From here?" The great merchant frowned. "My message is for the people of Nantes, and from here I can speak at once to the greatest number of Nantais of all ranks, and it is my desire, and the desire of those whom I represent, that as great a number as possible should hear my message at first hand." "Tell me, sir, is it true that the king has dissolved the states?" Andre-Louis looked at him. He smiled apologetically and waved a hand towards the crowd, which by now was straining for a glimpse of this slim young man who had brought forth the president and more than half the numbers of the chamber, guessing already with that curious instinct of crowds that he was the awaited bearer of tidings.
"Summon the gentlemen of your chamber, monsieur," said he, "and you shall hear all." "So be it." A word, and forth they came to crowd upon the steps, but leaving clear the topmost step and a half-moon space in the middle. To the spot so indicated Andre-Louis now advanced very deliberately. He took his stand there, dominating the entire assembly. He removed his hat, and launched the opening bombshell of that address which is historic, marking as it does one of the great stages of France's progress towards revolution. "People of this great city of Nantes, I have come to summon you to arms." In the amazed and rather scared silence that followed, he surveyed them for a moment before resuming. "I am a delegate of the people of Rennes, charged to announce to you what is taking place, and to invite you in this dreadful hour of our country's peril to rise and march to her defense." "Name! Your name!" a voice shouted, and instantly the cry was taken up by others until the multitude rang with the question. He could not answer that excited mob as he had answered the president. It was necessary to compromise, and he did so happily. "My name," said he, "is Omnis Omnibus, all for all. Let that suffice for now. I am a herald, a mouthpiece, a voice, no more. I come to announce to you that since the privileged orders assembled for the states of Brittany and Rennes resisted your will, our will, despite the king's plain hint to them, His Majesty has dissolved the states." There was a burst of delirious applause. Men laughed and shouted, and cries of "Vive le roi!" rolled forth like thunder. Andre-Louis waited, and gradually the preternatural gravity of his countenance came to be observed, and to beget the suspicion that there might be more to follow. Gradually silence was restored, and at last Andre-Louis was able to proceed. "You rejoice too soon. Unfortunately, the nobles, in their insolent arrogance, have elected to ignore the royal dissolution, and in despite of it persist in sitting and in conducting matters as seems good to them." A silence of utter dismay greeted that disconcerting epilogue to the announcement that had been so rapturously received. Andre-Louis continued after a moment's pause. "So that these men, who were already rebels against the people, rebels against justice and equity, rebels against humanity itself, are now also rebels against their king. Sooner than yield an inch of the unconscionable privileges by which too long already they have flourished, to the misery of a whole nation, they will make a mock of royal authority, hold up the king himself to contempt. They are determined to prove that there is no real sovereignty in France but the sovereignty of their own parasitic fainéantise." There was a faint splutter of applause, but the majority of the audience remained silent, waiting. "This is no new thing. Always has it been the same. No minister in the last 10 years who, seeing the needs and perils of the state, counseled the measures that we now demand as the only means of arresting our motherland in its ever-quickening progress to the abyss, but found himself as a consequence cast out of office by the influence which privilege brought to bear against him. Twice already has Monsieur Necker been called to the ministry, to be twice dismissed when his insistent counsels of reform threatened the privileges of clergy and nobility. For the 3rd time now he has been called to office, and at last it seems we are to have States General in spite of privilege. But what the privileged orders can no longer prevent, they are determined to stultify. Since it is now a settled thing that these States General are to meet, at least the nobles and the clergy will see to it, unless we take measures to prevent them, by packing the Third Estate with their own creatures and denying it all effective representation, they convert the States General into an instrument of their own will for the perpetuation of abuses by which they live. To achieve this end, they will stop at nothing. They have flouted the authority of the king, and they are silencing by assassination those who raise their voices to condemn them. Yesterday in Rennes, 2 young men who addressed the people as I am addressing you were done to death in the streets by assassins at the instigation of the nobility. Their blood cries out for vengeance. Beginning in a sullen mutter, the indignation that moved his hearers swelled up to express itself in a roar of anger. Citizens of Nantes, the motherland is in peril. Let us march to her defense. Let us proclaim it to the world that we recognize that the measures to liberate the Third Estate from the slavery in which for centuries it has groaned find only obstacles in those orders whose frenetic egotism sees in the tears and suffering of the unfortunate an odious tribute which they would pass on to their generation still unborn. Realizing from the barbarity of the means employed by our enemies to perpetuate our oppression that we have everything to fear from the aristocracy they would set up as a constitutional principle for the governing of France, let us declare ourselves at once enfranchised from it. The establishment of liberty and equality should be the aim of every citizen member of the Third Estate, and to this end we should stand indivisibly united, especially the young and vigorous, especially those who have had the good fortune to be born late enough to be able to gather for themselves the precious fruits of the philosophy of this 18th century. Acclamations broke out unstintedly now. He had caught them in the snare of his oratory, and he pressed his advantage instantly. "Let us all swear," he cried in a great voice, "to raise up in the name of humanity and of liberty a rampart against our enemies, to oppose to their blood-thirsty covetousness the calm perseverance of men whose cause is just. And let us protest here and in advance against any tyrannical decrees that should declare us seditious, when we have none but pure and just intentions. Let us make oath upon the honor of our motherland, that should any of us be seized by an unjust tribunal, intending against us one of those acts termed of political expediency, which are in fact but acts of despotism, let us swear, I say, to give a full expression to the strength that is in us, and do that in self-defense, which nature, courage, and despair dictate to us." Loud and long rolled the applause that greeted his conclusion, and he observed with satisfaction, and even some inward grim amusement, that the wealthy merchants who had been congregated upon the steps, and who now came crowding about him to shake him by the hand and to acclaim him, were not merely participants in, but the actual leaders of,
this delirium of enthusiasm. It confirmed him, had he needed confirmation, in his conviction that just as the philosophies upon which this new movement was based had their source in thinkers extracted from the bourgeoisie, so the need to adopt those philosophies to the practical purposes of life was most acutely felt at present by those bourgeois who found themselves debarred by privilege from the expansion their wealth permitted them. If it might be said of Andre-Louis that he had that day lighted the torch of the Revolution in Nantes, it might, with even greater truth, be said that the torch itself was supplied by the opulent bourgeoisie. I need not dwell at any length upon the sequel. It is a matter of history how that oath which Omnis Omnibus administered to the citizens of Nantes formed the backbone of the formal protest which they drew up and signed in their thousands. Nor were the results of that powerful protest, which, after all, might already be said to harmonize with the expressed will of the sovereign himself, long delayed. Who shall say how far it may have strengthened the hand of Necker, when on the 27th of that same month of November he compelled the council to adopt the most significant and comprehensive of all those measures to which clergy and nobility had refused their consent. On that date was published the royal decree ordaining that the deputies to be elected to the States General should number at least 1,000, and that the deputies of the Third Estate should be fully representative by numbering as many as the deputies of clergy and nobility together.
Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Dusk of the following day was falling when the homing Andre-Louis approached Gavrillac. Realizing fully what a hue and cry there would presently be for the apostle of revolution, who had summoned the people of Nantes to arms, he desired as far as possible to conceal the fact that he had been in that maritime city. Therefore he made a wide detour, crossing the river at Bruges, and recrossing it a little above Chavagne, so as to approach Gavrillac from the north, and create the impression that he was returning from Rennes, whither he was known to have gone 2 days ago. Within a mile or so of the village he caught in the fading light his first glimpse of a figure on horseback pacing slowly towards him, but it was not until they had come within a few yards of each other, and he observed that this cloaked figure was leaning forward to peer at him, that he took much notice of it, and then he found himself challenged almost at once by a woman's voice. "It is you, Andre, at last!" He drew rein, mildly surprised, to be assailed by another question, impatiently, anxiously asked. "Where have you been?" "Where have I been, Cousin Aline? Oh, seeing the world." "I have been patrolling this road since noon today, waiting for you." She spoke breathlessly, in haste to explain. "A troop of the Marechaussee from Rennes descended upon Gavrillac this morning in quest of you. They turned the chateau and the village inside out, and at last discovered that you were due to return with a horse hired from the Breton arm. So they have taken up their quarters at the inn to wait for you. I have been here all the afternoon on the lookout, to warn you against walking into that trap." "My dear Aline, that I should have been the cause of so much concern and trouble." "Never mind that. It is not important." "On the contrary, it is the most important part of what you tell me. It is the rest that is unimportant." "Do you realize that they have come to arrest you?" she asked him with increasing impatience. "You are wanted for sedition, and upon a warrant from Monsieur de Lesdiguières." "Sedition," quoth he, and his thoughts flew to that business at Nantes. It was impossible that they could have news of it in Rennes, and acted upon it in so short a time. "Yes, Sedition. The sedition of that wicked speech of yours at Rennes on Wednesday." "Oh, that," said he. "Pooh!" His note of relief might have told her, had she been more attentive, that he had to fear the consequences of a greater wickedness committed since. "Why, that was nothing." "Nothing?" "I almost suspect that the real intentions of these gentlemen of the Marechaussee have been misunderstood. Most probably they have come to thank me on M. de Lesdiguieres' behalf. I restrained the people when they would have burnt the Palais and himself inside it." "After you had first incited them to do it? I suppose you were afraid of your work. You drew back at the last moment. But you said things of M. de Lesdiguieres, if you are correctly reported, which he will never forgive." "I see," said Andre-Louis, and he fell into thought. But Mademoiselle de Kercadiou had already done what thinking was necessary, and her alert young mind had settled all that was to be done. "You must not go into Gavrillac," she told him, "and you must get down from your horse and let me take it. I will stable it at the chateau tonight, and sometime tomorrow afternoon, by when you should be well away, I will return it to the Breton arm." "Oh, but that is impossible." "Impossible? Why?" "For several reasons. One of them is that you haven't considered what will happen to you if you do such a thing." "To me? Do you suppose I am afraid of that pack of oafs sent by M. de Lesdiguieres? I have committed no sedition." "But it is almost as bad to give aid to one who is wanted for the crime. That is the law." "What do I care for the law? Do you imagine that the law will presume to touch me?" "Of course there is that. You are sheltered by one of the abuses I complained of at Rennes. I was forgetting." "Complain of it as much as you please, but meanwhile profit by it. Come, Andre, do as I tell you. Get down from your horse." And then, as he still hesitated, she stretched out and caught him by the arm. Her voice was vibrant with earnestness. "Andre, you don't realize how serious is your position. If these people take you, it is almost certain that you will be hanged. Don't you realize it? You must not go to Gavrillac. You must go away at once, and lie completely lost for a time until this blows over. Indeed, until my uncle can bring influence to bear to obtain your pardon, you must keep in hiding." "That will be a long time, then," said Andre-Louis. "M. de Kercadiou has never cultivated friends at court." "There is M. de La Tour d'Azyr," she reminded him, to his astonishment. "That man!" he cried, and then he laughed. "But it was chiefly against him that I aroused the resentment of the people of Rennes. I should have known that all my speech was not reported to you." "It was, and that part of it among the rest." "Ah, and yet you are concerned to save me, the man who seeks the life of your future husband at the hands either of the law or of the people? Or is it, perhaps, that since you have seen his true nature revealed in the murder of poor Philippe, you have changed your views on the subject of becoming Marquise de La Tour d'Azyr?" "You often show yourself without any faculty of deductive reasoning." "Perhaps, but hardly to the extent of imagining that M. de La Tour d'Azyr will ever lift a finger to do as you suggest." "In which, as usual, you are wrong. He will certainly do so if I ask him." "If you ask him?" Sheer horror rang in his voice. "Why, yes. You see, I have not yet said that I will be Marquise de La Tour d'Azyr. I am still considering. It is a position that has its advantages. One of them is that it ensures a suitor's complete obedience." So, I see the crooked logic of your mind. You might go so far as to say to him, "Refuse me this, and I shall refuse to be your Marquise." You would go so far as that? "At need, I might." "And do you not see the converse implication? Do you not see that your hands would then be tied? That you would be wanting in honour if afterwards you refused him?"
And do you think that I would consent to anything that could so tie your hands? Do you think I want to see you damned, Aline?" Her hand fell away from his arm. "Oh, you are mad!" she exclaimed, quite out of patience. "Possibly. But I like my madness. There is a thrill in it unknown to such sanity as yours. By your leave, Aline, I think I will ride on to Gavrillac." "Andre, you must not. It is death to you." In her alarm, she backed her horse and pulled it across the road to bar his way. It was almost completely night by now, but from behind the rack of clouds overhead a crescent moon sailed out to alleviate the darkness. "Come now," she enjoined him. "Be reasonable. Do as I bid you. See, there is a carriage coming up behind you. Do not let us be found here together thus." He made up his mind quickly. He was not the man to be actuated by false heroics about dying, and he had no fancy whatever for the gallows of M. de Lesdiguieres' providing. The immediate task that he had set himself might be accomplished. He had made heard, and ringingly, the voice that M. de La Tour d'Azyr imagined he had silenced. But he was very far from having done with life. "Aline, on one condition only." "And that?" "That you swear to me you will never seek the aid of M. de La Tour d'Azyr on my behalf." "Since you insist, and as time presses, I consent. And now ride on with me as far as the lane. There is that carriage coming up." The lane to which she referred was one that branched off the road some 300 yards nearer the village, and led straight up the hill to the chateau itself. In silence they rode together towards it, and together they turned into that thickly hedged and narrow bypath. At a depth of 50 yards she halted him. "Now," she bade him. Obediently he swung down from his horse and surrendered the reins to her. "Aline," he said, "I haven't the words in which to thank you." "It isn't necessary," said she. "But I shall hope to repay you some day." "Nor is that necessary. Could I do less than I am doing? I do not want to hear of you hanged, Andre, nor does my uncle, though he is very angry with you." "I suppose he is." "And you can hardly be surprised. You were his delegate, his representative. He depended upon you, and you have turned your coat. He is rightly indignant, calls you a traitor, and swears that he will never speak to you again. But he doesn't want you hanged, Andre." "Then we are agreed on that, at least, for I don't want it myself." "I will make your peace with him. And now, goodbye, Andre. Send me a word when you are safe." She held out a hand that looked ghostly in the faint light. He took it and bore it to his lips. "God bless you, Aline." She was gone, and he stood listening to the receding clopper-clop of hooves until it grew faint in the distance. Then, slowly, with shoulders hunched and head sunk on his breast, he retraced his steps to the main road, cogitating whither he should go. Quite suddenly he checked, remembering with dismay that he was almost entirely without money. In Brittany itself he knew of no dependable hiding-place, and as long as he was in Brittany his peril must remain imminent. Yet to leave the province, and to leave it as quickly as prudence dictated, horses would be necessary. And how was he to procure horses, having no money beyond a single louis d'or and a few pieces of silver? There was also the fact that he was very weary. He had had little sleep since Tuesday night, and not very much then, and much of the time had been spent in the saddle, a wearing thing to one so little accustomed to long rides. Worn as he was, it was unthinkable that he should go far tonight. He might get as far as Chavagne, perhaps, But there he must sup and sleep. And what then of tomorrow? Had he but thought of it before, perhaps Aline might have been able to assist him with the loan of a few louis. His first impulse now was to follow her to the chateau. But prudence dismissed the notion. Before he could reach her, he must be seen by servants, and word of his presence would go forth. There was no choice for him. He must tramp as far as Chavagne, find a bed there, and leave tomorrow until it dawned. On the resolve, he set his face in the direction whence he had come. But again he paused. Chavagne lay on the road to Rennes. To go that way was to plunge further into danger. He would strike south again. At the foot of some meadows on this side of the village there was a ferry that would put him across the river. Thus he would avoid the village, and by placing the river between himself and the immediate danger, he would obtain an added sense of security. A lane turning out of the high road, a quarter of a mile this side of Gavrillac, led down to that ferry. By this lane, some 20 minutes later, came Andre-Louis with dragging feet. He avoided the little cottage of the ferryman, whose window was alight, and in the dark crept down to the boat, intending, if possible, to put himself across. He felt for the chain by which the boat was moored, and ran his fingers along this to the point where it was fastened. Here, to his dismay, he found a padlock. He stood up in the gloom and laughed silently. Of course, he might have known it. The ferry was the property of Monsieur de la Tour d'Azyr, and not likely to be left unfastened so that poor devils might cheat him of seigneurial dues. There being no possible alternative, he walked back to the cottage and rapped on the door. When it opened, he stood well back and aside out of the shaft of light that issued thence. "Ferry," he rapped out, laconically. The ferryman, a burly scoundrel well known to him, turned aside to pick up a lantern and came forth as he was bidden. As he stepped from the little porch, he levelled the lantern so that its light fell on the face of this traveller. "My God!" he ejaculated. "You realize, I see, that I am pressed," said Andre-Louis, his eyes on the fellow's startled countenance. "And well you may be, with the gallows waiting for you at Rennes," growled the ferryman. "Since you've been so foolish as to come back to Gavrillac, you had better go again as quickly as you can. I will say nothing of having seen you." "I thank you, Fresnel. Your advice accords with my intention. That is why I need the boat." "Ah, that. No," said Fresnel with determination. "I'll hold my peace, but it's as much as my skin's worth to help you." "You need not have seen my face. Forget that you have seen it." "I'll do that, monsieur, but that is all I will do. I cannot put you across the river." "Then give me the key of the boat, and I will put myself across." "That is the same thing. I cannot." "I'll hold my tongue, but I will not. I dare not help you." Andre-Louis looked a moment into that sullen, resolute face, and understood. This man, living under the shadow of La Tour d'Azyr, dared exercise no will that might be in conflict with the will of his dread lord. "Fresnel," he said quietly, "if, as you say, the gallows claim me, the thing that has brought me to this extremity arises out of the shooting of Mabey. Had not Mabey been murdered, there would have been no need for me to have raised my voice as I have done. Mabey was your friend, I think. Will you, for his sake, lend me the little help I need to save my neck?" The man kept his glance averted, and the cloud of sullenness deepened on his face. "I would if I dared, but I dare not." Then quite suddenly he became angry. It was as if in anger he sought support. "Don't you understand that I dare not? Would you have a poor man risk his life for you? What have you or yours ever done for me that you should ask that? You do not cross tonight in my ferry. Understand that, monsieur. And go at once. Go, before I remember that it may be dangerous even to have talked to you, and not give information. Now go!" He turned on his heel to re-enter his cottage, and a wave of hopelessness swept over Andre-Louis. But in a second it was gone. The man must be compelled, and he had the means. He bethought him of a pistol pressed upon him by Le Chapelier at the moment of his leaving Rennes, a gift which at the time he had almost disdained. True, it was not loaded, and he had no ammunition. But how was Fresnel to know that? He acted quickly. As with his right hand he pulled it from his pocket, with his left he caught the ferryman by the shoulder and swung him round. "What do you want now?" Fresnel demanded angrily. "Haven't I told you that I—" He broke off short. The muzzle of the pistol was within a foot of his eyes. "I want the key of the boat. That is all, Fresnel. And you can either give it me at once, or I'll take it after I have burnt your brains. I should regret to kill you, but I shall not hesitate. It is your life against mine, Fresnel, and you'll not find it strange that if one of us must die, I prefer that it shall be you." Fresnel dipped a hand into his pocket and fetched thence a key. He held it out to Andre-Louis in fingers that shook, more in anger than in fear. "I yield to violence," he said, showing his teeth like a snarling dog. "But don't imagine that it will greatly profit you." Andre-Louis took the key. His pistol remained levelled. "You threaten me, I think," he said. "It is not difficult to read your threat. The moment I am gone, you will run to inform against me. You will set the marechaussee on my heels to overtake me." "No, no!" cried the other. He perceived his peril. He read his doom in the cold, sinister note on which Andre-Louis addressed him, and grew afraid. "I swear to you, monsieur, that I have no such intention." "I think I had better make quite sure of you." "Oh, my God! Have mercy, monsieur!" The knave was in a palsy of terror. "I mean you no harm. I swear to heaven I mean you no harm. I will not say a word. I will not." "I would rather depend upon your silence than your assurances. Still, you shall have your chance. I am a fool, perhaps, but I have a reluctance to shed blood. Go into the house, Fresnel. Go, man. I follow you." In the shabby main room of that dwelling, Andre-Louis halted him again. "Get me a length of rope," he commanded, and was readily obeyed. 5 minutes later, Fresnel was securely bound to a chair, and effectively silenced by a very uncomfortable gag improvised out of a block of wood and a muffler. On the threshold, the departing Andre-Louis turned. "Good night, Fresnel," he said. Fierce eyes glared mute hatred at him. "It is unlikely that your ferry will be required again tonight, but someone is sure to come to your relief quite early in the morning. Until then, bear your discomfort with what fortitude you can, remembering that you have brought it entirely upon yourself by your uncharitableness. If you spend the night considering that, the lesson should not be lost upon you. By morning you may have even grown so charitable as not to know who it was that tied you up. Good night." He stepped out and closed the door. To unlock the ferry and pull himself across the swift-running waters, on which the faint moonlight was making a silver ripple, were matters that engaged not more than 6 or 7 minutes. He drove the nose of the boat through the decaying sedges that fringed the southern bank of the stream, sprang ashore, and made the little craft secure. Then, missing the footpath in the dark, he struck out across a sodden meadow in quest of the road.